The thunder cracked across the Montana sky like a whip against leather, but Harriet Winters didn't flinch, not even when the first fat raindrops spattered against her cheeks. She had more important concerns than a brewing storm, namely the 200-pound bull that had broken through her fence and now stood between her and the safety of her small ranch house. The year was 1885, and being a woman alone in Broken Ridge meant facing down trouble with nothing but your own wits and whatever weapon you might have at hand. Unfortunately for Harriet, her shotgun was safely stowed inside the house, and all she had was a broken fence post and her stubborn determination. The bull snorted, pawing at the ground, its massive head lowering for a charge. Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated her odds. "Not good, not good at all. I'd step back if I were you, madam," a deep voice called from behind her. "That's Rutherford's prized bull, and he doesn't take kindly to strangers." Harriet didn't dare turn to look at the voice's owner. "Thank you for the advice," she replied through gritted teeth. "But if I move, he charges. If he charges, my vegetable garden is destroyed, and that's my livelihood until harvest." She heard the soft creak of saddle leather and the gentle patting of hooves on damp earth as the stranger guided his horse around to her side. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of worn leather boots, dusty chaps, and a worn Stetson pulled low against the darkening sky. "Name's Yates Tucker," he said quietly, "and I believe I can help you with your predicament if you'll allow it." The rain began to fall in earnest now, cold droplets sliding down Harriet's neck and beneath the collar of her blouse. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with fear. "I'd be much obliged, Mr. Tucker," she managed, still not taking her eyes off the bull. With fluid grace that belied his tall frame, Yates Tucker slid from his horse and slowly unwound a length of rope from his saddle. "When I give the word," he murmured, "you make for that porch. Don't run, just walk steady and don't look back. But your horse, Brutus, knows what to do. Now, on my count, 1, 2, 3. Harriet backed away as Yates let out a piercing whistle. The bull's attention snapped to him, just as his horse, a magnificent chestnut with a white blaze, trotted forward, placing itself between them and the bull. In one smooth motion, Yates twirled his lasso and sent it sailing through the rain-filled air, settling perfectly around the bull's horns. Harriet didn't wait to see more. She turned and made for the porch, her boots sliding in the mud. Behind her, she heard the snort of the bull, a shout from Yates, and the sound of hooves churning earth. She reached the porch steps and spun around, gasping at the sight. Yates had somehow managed to secure the bull to a sturdy oak near the fence line. He stood in the pouring rain, his hat now plastered to his head, water streaming down his face as he checked the knots. His horse stood nearby, seemingly unbothered by the deluge or the dangerous beast secured just yards away. Relief flooded through Harriet, followed quickly by concern as she noticed how the rain had soaked through Yates's shirt, clinging to broad shoulders. "Mr. Tucker," she called out. "You'll catch cold." He turned to her then, and though they were separated by 20 feet of rain-washed yard, she could see the slow smile that transformed his face, a face she now realized was handsome in a weathered way, with laugh lines around blue eyes and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. "Not if you keep smiling like that," he called back, touching the brim of his soaked hat. The unexpected warmth in his voice sent a flush to Harriet's cheeks that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Something stirred in her, then a feeling long dormant since she'd buried her father and taken on the ranch alone 2 years prior. "Well, at least come inside and dry off while I make some coffee," she offered, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look with her auburn hair escaping its pins and her skirt mudded to the knees. Yates secured his horse beneath the lean-to beside her house and jogged through the rain to her porch. Up close, he was taller than she'd realized, easily 6 feet to her 5'4" frame. Water dripped from his Stetson onto broad shoulders, and his eyes were the blue of a summer sky, not the stormy gray of the current one. "Obliged," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through damp, sandy brown hair. "I've been tracking that bull since sunrise. Rutherford's going to be mighty relieved I found him before he caused more damage." "Rutherford," Harriet repeated, opening her door and gesturing him inside. "Would that be Elijah Rutherford from over Cherry Creek Way?" "The same," Yates confirmed, hesitating at the threshold. "Madam, I'm soaked through. I don't want to ruin your floors." "It's Harriet." "Harriet Winters," she replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious in her own home. "And they're just floors, Mr. Tucker, nothing a mop can't fix." Inside, the small ranch house was modest but meticulously kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the embers still glowing from the morning's fire. Harriet busied herself adding logs, grateful for something to do with her hands while acutely aware of the tall stranger dripping on her rag rug. "There are some of my father's old clothes in that chest," she said, nodding toward a wooden trunk beneath the window. "They might be a bit short in the arms, but they're dry. You can change behind that screen while I put the coffee on." Yates looked ready to protest, then sneezed, seemingly proving her point about catching cold. "Thank you, Miss Winters. Your hospitality is unexpected but much appreciated." As Harriet measured coffee beans into her grinder, she found herself listening to the sounds of him moving behind the screen, the soft thud of boots being removed, the rustle of wet clothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she pumped the grinder handle. "If you don't mind my asking," she called, keeping her voice steady, "what brings you to these parts? I don't recall seeing you in Broken Ridge before." There was a pause before he answered. "I've been working ranches across 3 territories, landed at Rutherford's about a month ago. He hired me to help with the spring cattle drive." Yates emerged from behind the screen wearing her father's old flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that indeed revealed several inches of ankle. Despite the ill-fitting clothes, he still managed to look dignified. "Cattle drive," Harriet echoed, placing the coffee pot on the stove. "That's starting soon, isn't it? First week of May, usually." 10 days from now," he confirmed, taking the chair she offered at her small table. "Rutherford's herd is joining with the Bar M and Crowley's outfit for the push to the railhead in Helena." Harriet nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. The cattle drive meant opportunity for men. For her, it just meant more struggle. The markets would be focused on beef, with little interest in the vegetables she grew or the eggs her chickens laid. Last year, she'd barely made it through until harvest. "You have a nice place here," Yates observed, his eyes taking in the neat shelves lined with preserves and the curtains she'd sewn herself from flour sacks. "Running it alone can't be easy." "It's not," Harriet admitted, surprising herself with her candor, "but it's mine. My father left it to me, and I intend to keep it." The coffee began to bubble, and she busied herself pouring 2 cups, avoiding his gaze. When she finally looked up, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her flush again. "Most women would have sold out by now," he observed, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "I'm not most women, Mr. Tucker." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No, I don't believe you are." Outside, the rain continued to beat against the roof, creating a cozy backdrop to their conversation. Harriet found herself telling this stranger things she hadn't spoken of to anyone: her struggles with the bank, her plans to expand her vegetable garden, her hope to buy a milk cow come fall. Yates listened, offering practical suggestions without condescension, speaking of his own experiences riding with cattle outfits across the territories. "So you're a true wanderer," Harriet said as she poured them each a second cup of coffee. "Never staying in one place too long." Something flickered across his face, a shadow of emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Been that way since the war," he said quietly. "Seemed easier than putting down roots only to lose them." The war. He must have been just a boy when it ended, she calculated, perhaps 16 or 17. Young, but not too young to have seen things no boy should see. "And your family?" she ventured. "Lost Pa at Shiloh. Ma held on until 68, then the fever took her. My sister married a shopkeeper in St. Louis." He shrugged as if these losses were commonplace, which she supposed they were. Few families had emerged from the war unscathed. And yours? Besides your father, I mean. It's just me now, she answered. Ma died bringing my brother into the world when I was 12. The baby followed her a day later. Pa and I came west in 75. He had dreams of a cattle empire, but the harsh winter of 77 took most of our herd. We pivoted to growing food instead. Turns out I have a knack for making things grow. She gestured toward the window, where, beyond the curtain of rain, her fields waited. Pa's heart gave out 2 summers ago. I'm sorry, Yates said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain. Harriet couldn't remember the last time she'd sat with someone like this. No agenda. No business to discuss, just the simple pleasure of company. Eventually, the rain slowed to a gentle patter, and Yates rose to check on both his horse and the bull. Harriet followed him onto the porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the cool air. I should get this fella back to Rutherford, Yates said, nodding toward the bull, which had settled down and was now contentedly chewing on tufts of grass near the oak. And you'll be wanting your solitude back. It was no bother, Harriet said quickly, perhaps too quickly. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Thank you for your help. I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come along. Yates studied her for a moment, then said with a hint of admiration, something resourceful, I imagine. You strike me as a woman who finds ways to manage. He disappeared into the lean-to and emerged with his now somewhat drier clothes bundled under his arm. I'll return your father's things once I've had them washed. Keep them, Harriet said. They're of no use to me, and you might need dry clothes again someday. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. 2 people used to standing alone against the world. Much obliged, Miss Winters. He touched the brim of his hat, which he'd placed back on his head despite its dampness. Might be I'll pass by this way again after the cattle drive. I'll have coffee waiting, she said, surprising herself with her boldness. And it's Harriet, remember, he smiled then, a full smile that transformed his face and made something flutter in her chest. Harriet, he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name on his tongue. Until next time, then. Harriet watched him lead the bull away, his tall figure straight in the saddle despite the long day. Only when he'd disappeared around the bend did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth. For the first time in 2 years, she was looking forward to something beyond survival. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's storm had washed everything clean. Harriet rose with the sun, as she always did, but found herself humming as she gathered eggs and tended to her chores. She told herself it was simply relief that her garden had survived both the bull and the downpour, but she knew better. For 10 days, she worked her land from sunup to sundown, repairing the fence damaged by the bull, planting the last of her spring crops, and cleaning the chicken coop until it practically gleamed. If she found herself looking up more often than usual whenever the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her, well, that was just normal caution. On the 10th day, the day the cattle drive was set to begin, Harriet stood at the fence line, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. In the distance, she could see the dust cloud that signified the movement of many animals. The Rutherford herd would be passing by the main road, about a mile from her property. She told herself she wasn't watching for any particular rider. She was startled by the sound of a horse approaching not from the direction of the road, but from the small trail that led directly to her property. Her heart leaped before she could temper its reaction. Yates Tucker rode into view, looking every inch the working cowboy. His clothes were clean but trail-worn, his face tanned from days in the sun. He rode with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in the saddle. "Afternoon, Harriet," he called, guiding his horse to her fence. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, hoping her voice sounded casual. "I thought you'd be with the herd by now." "Heading there directly," he confirmed. Rutherford gave me a task along the way. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. This is for the bull damage and your fence, he insists. Harriet hesitated before accepting the pouch. It felt heavy with coins. That's not necessary, the garden survived and I've already fixed the fence. Nevertheless, Yates said firmly, Rutherford's a fair man, he pays his debts. He glanced toward her house. I also brought these back. He patted a bundle tied behind his saddle. Your father's clothes cleaned and pressed by Mrs. Rutherford herself. You didn't have to return them, Harriet said, but she was touched by the gesture. A man keeps his word, Yates replied simply. He seemed to hesitate before adding, I also wanted to see how you were faring after the storm. The rain was good for the seedlings, she said, gesturing toward her garden where green shoots were already pushing through the dark soil. Everything's growing strong. I'm glad to hear it. He shifted in the saddle, looking suddenly unsure of himself. I should get back, the herd won't wait. Harriet nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest. Of course, safe travels, Mr. Tucker. Yates, he corrected with a small smile. And I meant what I said, I'll be passing back this way after we reach Helena. I'll have that coffee waiting, she replied, returning his smile. He touched his hat and turned his horse, but then paused. Harriet, he said, looking back over his shoulder, would it be presumptuous to write to you while I'm on the trail? The question caught her off guard. No, it wouldn't be presumptuous at all. I'd like that. Something in his expression lightened. Then expect a letter when we reach the first post stop in Gold Creek. Good day, Harriet. This time when he rode away, Harriet's disappointment was tempered by anticipation. A letter. Such a simple thing, and yet the prospect filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. True to his word, Yates's first letter arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by the weekly mail carrier who serviced the outlying ranches. Harriet's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, surprised by her own eagerness. The letter was written in a strong, clear hand, not the rough scrawl she might have expected from a cowboy. Yates wrote of the cattle drive, the long days in the saddle, the nights spent beneath stars so numerous they looked like spilled sugar across the sky. He described a river crossing gone wrong, and how they'd nearly lost a dozen head before the wranglers managed to redirect the panicked cattle. He wrote of Rutherford's youngest hand, a boy of 16, on his first drive, and how the other men had played a harmless prank by sewing his bedroll shut while he slept. What struck Harriet most was how Yates noticed the beauty around him the way morning mist rose from the valley floor like spirits dancing, how a particular sunset had painted the mountains the color of ripe plums. These were not observations she expected from a man who spent his days chasing stubborn cattle. She read the letter 3 times before sitting down to compose her reply. What could she possibly write that would interest a man seeing such grand vistas and living such adventures? Her days were filled with weeding, tending chickens, and preserving the early spring vegetables. Hardly the stuff of captivating correspondence. And yet, she found herself filling 3 pages with descriptions of her daily life, how the fox had returned to try for her chickens again, how she'd traded with a passing Salish family, exchanging vegetables for beautifully tanned leather she planned to make into winter gloves. She told him about the new techniques she was trying in her garden and her plans to possibly plant an apple orchard come fall if the bank would extend her credit. She sealed the letter and gave it to the carrier the following week, then tried not to count the days until a reply might come. 2 more letters arrived before June turned to July, each longer than the last. With each exchange, Harriet felt as if she was getting to know Yates in a way that went deeper than their brief meeting had allowed. He wrote of his childhood in Tennessee, his travels after the war, the best horse he'd ever owned, a stubborn Appaloosa named General that had saved his life during a blizzard in Wyoming Territory. He asked questions about her life, her plans, her dreams, questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In her replies, Harriet found herself sharing thoughts she'd never voiced aloud: her fear of losing the ranch, her determination to make it on her own when everyone said a woman couldn't, her secret wish to one day see the ocean. With each letter she sent, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Whether it was the act of sharing her burdens or the knowledge that someone actually wanted to hear them, she couldn't say. By the time August arrived, bringing with it a scorching heat that threatened to wilt even her hardiest crops, Harriet had received 5 letters from Yates. The cattle drive had reached Helena successfully, he wrote, and after a week of much-needed rest, they were beginning the journey back with supplies for the ranches and news from the outside world. Expect us by the 3rd week of August, his last letter concluded. I find myself looking forward to that cup of coffee we discussed. I hope the offer still stands. Harriet folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept all his correspondence. Of course, the offer still stood. What worried her was how much she was looking forward to seeing him again, how often she found herself thinking of his smile, his voice, the way he'd looked at her as if truly seeing her. Such thoughts were dangerous. Yates Tucker was a wanderer by his own admission, a man who didn't stay in one place long. And even if he did stay at Rutherford's ranch through the winter, what then? A few visits, more letters. She had a ranch to run, a life she'd built with her own 2 hands. She couldn't afford distraction, especially not the kind that came with blue eyes and a slow smile. No, it would be better to keep things friendly but distant. She would offer him coffee as promised, thank him for his letters, and then gently but firmly establish boundaries. It was the sensible thing to do. But as Harriet worked in her garden under the August sun, pulling weeds with more force than necessary, she had to admit that when it came to Yates Tucker, she wasn't feeling particularly sensible. The 3rd week of August arrived, bringing with it no sign of the returning cattle drive. Harriet tried not to be disappointed each time she heard hoofbeats on the road that turned out to be merely passing travelers or the weekly mail carrier. The latter brought news. However, a bridge had washed out along the return route, forcing the drovers to take a longer path home. They were delayed but safe. Relief mingled with impatience as Harriet threw herself into the harvest. Her garden had yielded bountifully, and she spent long days picking, preserving, and preparing vegetables to sell at the Broken Ridge Market. The work was exhausting but satisfying, especially when she calculated the profits. If all went well, she might not need to ask the bank for that extension after all. It was nearly dusk on the first day of September when Harriet, arms laden with the day's harvest of tomatoes, heard the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching. She turned to see Yates guiding his chestnut gelding up the path to her house. He looked trail-worn but healthy tanner than before, his hair a shade lighter from the sun. Harriet's heart performed a ridiculous little skip in her chest, and she silently chided herself for it. "You're late," she called, aiming for a teasing tone rather than the breathless one that threatened to emerge. "I was beginning to think you'd found a better offer of coffee somewhere along the trail." He dismounted with that same fluid grace she remembered, a smile warming his features. "No coffee from Wyoming to Montana can compare to what I've been promised here," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "The bridge washout cost us 10 days and we lost 3 head crossing the river. Otherwise, it would have been a perfect drive." He took a few steps toward her, then seemed to remember himself. "I've brought you something," he said, turning back to his saddlebags. "A small token from Helena." He extracted a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Harriet set her basket of tomatoes on the porch steps and wiped her hands on her apron before accepting it. "You didn't need to bring me anything," she said, suddenly feeling shy. "I wanted to," he replied simply. Carefully, she untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a book, a beautifully bound copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. She ran her fingers over the embossed cover, momentarily speechless. "You mentioned in your second letter that you enjoyed poetry but had few books here," Yates explained, watching her reaction closely. "I thought this might be welcome company during the winter evenings." "It's perfect," Harriet said softly, clutching the book to her chest. Truly, thank you. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away: the setting sun, the waiting horse, the basket of tomatoes. There was only this man who had thought of her while miles away, who had remembered a small detail from a letter and acted on it. How about that coffee? She said finally, breaking the spell, "You must be tired from the trail." "I'd be grateful," Yates acknowledged. "Mind if I see to Brutus first?" As Yates settled his horse in the small corral beside her lean-to, Harriet hurried inside to put on fresh coffee and tidy her appearance. She removed her dirt-stained apron, quickly pinned up loose strands of hair, and splashed cool water on her face. She was being foolish. She knew Yates had seen her muddy and rain-soaked during their first meeting, but she couldn't help wanting to look her best. When he entered the house, ducking his head slightly under the door frame, Harriet was struck again by his presence. He wasn't a flashy man. His clothes were practical and worn, his manner straightforward, but he filled the small room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the stove where coffee was beginning to bubble. "Sit," she offered, gesturing to the table. "You must be exhausted after the long ride." "Been sitting in a saddle for weeks," he countered with a small smile. "Standing feels better at the moment." So they both stood somewhat awkwardly in her kitchen, the air between them charged with something Harriet couldn't quite name. In person, Yates seemed both familiar and strange, the man she'd come to know through letters, now flesh and blood before her, bringing with him all the complications she'd been trying to dismiss. "How is your garden faring?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Your last letter mentioned concerns about the dry spell." Harriet latched onto the safe topic with relief. "Better than expected. The well hasn't run dry, thankfully, and I've been watering morning and evening. The tomatoes are especially abundant this year." She nodded toward the basket on her porch. "I'll be taking them to market tomorrow." "I could help you load them if you'd like," Yates offered, "and perhaps accompany you to town. The roads have been having trouble with bandits lately. Nothing serious, but it's always safer to travel with company." The offer was practical, sensible even, but Harriet detected something more behind it, a desire to spend more time in her company, perhaps. Or was she reading too much into simple kindness? "That would be appreciated," she said finally, pouring the coffee into 2 cups. "I have quite a lot to transport this time." They settled at the table, the initial awkwardness giving way to easier conversation as Yates recounted more details from the drive and Harriet shared news of Broken Ridge. It was strange how comfortable it felt, how natural, despite the months apart. The letters had built a foundation of familiarity that now supported their in-person interaction. As dusk deepened into night, Harriet lit the oil lamp, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. The conversation flowed from topic to topic: books they had read, places they had seen, hopes for the coming winter. Yates mentioned he had been offered a permanent position at Rutherford's ranch, overseeing the cattle through the winter and helping to train horses come spring. "So you're staying in Broken Ridge?" Harriet asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Seems that way," he replied, studying her over the rim of his coffee cup. "It's a good opportunity. Rutherford's getting on in years and his son is more interested in politics than ranching. He needs someone reliable to manage things." "That sounds promising," Harriet said, genuinely pleased for him. "Stability has its benefits." "Indeed it does," Yates agreed, his gaze steady on hers. "I've been a wanderer long enough. Perhaps it's time to see what putting down roots feels like." There was a weight to his words that made Harriet's pulse quicken. Before she could formulate a response, Yates glanced out the window at the darkened sky. "I should head back to Rutherford's," he said, though he made no move to rise. "It's getting late and you have market day tomorrow." "Yes," Harriet agreed reluctantly. "Though you're welcome to the spare room if the ride seems too long. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean." The offer hung between them, fraught with implications neither of them seemed ready to address. Yates shook his head slowly. "Better not," he said softly. "But I appreciate the offer. I'll be here at dawn to help with those tomatoes if that suits you." "It does," she replied, rising to see him out. At the door he paused, turning to face her. In the lamplight, his features were softened, his eyes dark pools that seemed to hold questions she couldn't decipher. "Harriet," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation, both were worth the long ride." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, so brief she might have imagined it, except for the lingering warmth where his lips had touched her skin. "Until tomorrow," he said, and then he was gone, leaving Harriet standing in her doorway with her fingers pressed to her cheek and her heart hammering a rhythm that felt dangerously like hope. True to his word, Yates arrived at dawn, driving a small wagon rather than riding his horse. "Thought this might be more practical for your produce," he explained as he helped load not just tomatoes but also beans, squash, and the last of the summer berries. The trip to Broken Ridge was pleasant, the early morning air cool against their faces as the wagon bumped along the rutted road. Conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences. Harriet found herself sneaking glances at Yates's profile as he handled the reins, the strong line of his jaw, the way the corner of his mouth quirked up when he was amused, the capable hands that guided the horses with gentle confidence. The Broken Ridge market was bustling when they arrived. Harriet's vegetables, known for their quality, sold quickly. Several of the town's matrons eyed Yates with open curiosity as he helped customers load their purchases, his tall figure and easy manner drawing attention. "Who's the handsome fellow helping Harriet Winters?" Harriet overheard Mrs. Petersham ask the butcher's wife. Never seen her with a man before, thought she was determined to be a spinster. Harriet felt her cheeks heat, but before she could feel truly embarrassed, Yates appeared at her side, seemingly oblivious to the gossip swirling around them. "Last crate's empty," he announced with satisfaction. "You've had a successful day." "Thanks to your help," she acknowledged, tucking the money pouch into her pocket. "Would you like to get some lunch before we head back? The hotel serves a decent stew on market days." Yates's smile warmed his entire face. "I'd be honored to escort you to lunch, Miss Winters," he said, offering his arm with exaggerated formality that made her laugh. The hotel dining room was crowded, but they managed to find a small table near the window. As they ate, Harriet became aware of the glances being cast their way, some curious, some approving, some decidedly judgmental. She had lived in Broken Ridge long enough to know how quickly news traveled, and by sunset, every household would be discussing Harriet Winters and her mysterious male companion. "Does it bother you?" Yates asked quietly, nodding subtly toward a group of women who were failing to hide their interest. "The attention, I mean?" Harriet considered the question. 2 years ago it would have mortified her. Now she found she cared less about others' opinions. "No," she said finally. "Let them talk. They'd find something to gossip about regardless." Yates's expression was approving. "That's the spirit, though I should warn you Mrs. Rutherford has already hinted rather strongly that she'd like to know more about the lady I've been corresponding with." "And what did you tell her?" Harriet asked, curious despite herself. "The truth," he replied simply. "That you're the most interesting woman I've met in all my travels." The directness of his answer left Harriet momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, the hotel owner's wife appeared at their table. "Harriet Winters, as I live and breathe," exclaimed Mrs. Holbrook. "When Thomas told me you were dining with us today, I could hardly believe it. You haven't set foot in this establishment since your father's wake." Her curious gaze shifted to Yates. "And who might this gentleman be?" "Yates Tucker, madam," he replied, standing to shake her hand. "I work for Elijah Rutherford." "One of his drovers, are you?" Mrs. Holbrook asked, giving him an appraising once-over. "Recently promoted to ranch foreman," Yates corrected politely. Mrs. Holbrook's eyebrows rose, and she shot Harriet a look that clearly said, "Well done." To Harriet's mortification, the older woman then said aloud, "It's about time someone courted our Harriet properly. She works too hard on that ranch all alone." "Mrs. Holbrook," Harriet began, but Yates interrupted smoothly. Miss Winters has been kind enough to allow me to escort her today, but I wouldn't presume on her good nature by calling it courting just yet, he said, his tone friendly but firm. Though a man would be fortunate indeed to earn such consideration. Mrs. Holbrook looked between them, her expression knowing. Well, isn't that just lovely, she said. Your meal is on the house today, dears. Consider it my contribution to Broken Ridge's most interesting development since the Wilkins twins both married on the same day to sisters. After she bustled away, Harriet covered her face with her hands. I'm so sorry, she groaned. This is exactly why I avoid town when possible. To her surprise, Yates chuckled. No need to apologize. Mrs. Holbrook seems like a good-hearted woman if a bit eager to see everyone paired off. He paused, then added more seriously, unless the implication itself offends you, in which case I apologize for not correcting her more firmly. Harriet lowered her hands to find him watching her with an expression of genuine concern. It doesn't offend me, she said carefully. It's just complicated. Life usually is, he agreed, his gaze never leaving hers, but sometimes the complications are worth navigating. The rest of the meal passed in a charged silence, both of them aware that something had shifted between them, a tacit acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since their first meeting, nurtured through months of letters and culminating in this moment of shared understanding. As they drove back to Harriet's ranch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road, Yates finally broke the silence. I meant what I said to Mrs. Holbrook. I wouldn't presume on your good nature, but I would like to call on you properly if you're amenable. Harriet's heart beat a rapid tattoo against her ribs. I'd like that, she admitted, her voice steadier than she felt. But Yates, you should know I won't give up my ranch, not for anyone. It's not just land to me, it's my independence, my security. I wouldn't ask you to, he replied with a seriousness that matched her own. What you've built here by yourself, against all odds, it's remarkable. I admire it. I admire you. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. Then yes, she said simply, you may call on me. And so began a courtship that set Broken Ridge talking for months. Yates rode to Harriet's ranch twice a week, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just for coffee, always leaving before propriety could be questioned. They attended church together on Sundays, enduring the curious glances and whispered comments with dignified indifference. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Yates helped Harriet prepare her ranch for winter, mending the barn roof, chopping and stacking firewood that would see her through the coldest months, helping her plant the apple saplings she had finally been able to afford without the bank's assistance. In return, she knitted him a scarf and gloves for the coming cold, using the Salish traded leather she'd mentioned in her letters. Their courtship was unhurried, built on mutual respect and a deepening affection that neither felt the need to rush. They spoke of books they'd read, shared stories of their pasts, debated the merits of different farming techniques. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant hues. One crisp October evening, as they sat side by side on her porch swing, Yates took her hand in a gesture that had become familiar but no less thrilling. Winter's coming fast, he observed, his breath visible in the chilly air. First snow could be any day now. Harriet agreed, leaning slightly against his solid warmth. The chickens are molting heavily and the squirrels have been frantic, signs of a hard winter ahead. Yates was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. I've been thinking, he said finally. About winter, about how isolated this place gets when the snow piles high. I've weathered winters alone before, Harriet reminded him, though the thought of the coming months of solitude held less appeal than it once had. I know you have, he said. You're the most capable woman I've ever known, but I find myself concerned. Harriet turned to look at him, curious about the hesitation in his voice. Concerned for your safety, he clarified. And selfishly for the months I'll spend wondering how you're faring, unable to reach you if the pass is close. "What are you suggesting?" Harriet asked, her pulse quickening. Yates took a deep breath, then met her gaze directly. "Marry me," he said simply, "before the first snow falls. Let me stay here with you, help you run this place, share the burden and the joy of it. Or if you prefer, we could live at Rutherford's. I have a small cabin there as part of my position. Either way, I don't want to face another day, let alone a whole season without you by my side." Harriet's breath caught in her throat. She had known their relationship was heading in this direction, had felt the inevitability of it with each passing week. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud made it suddenly, wonderfully real. "Yates," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you certain? Marriage is a serious step, and we've known each other less than a year." "Some people know each other for decades and never truly see one another," he replied. "I saw you that first day in the rain, Harriet. I've seen you more clearly with each letter, each conversation, each moment we've shared. I know my own heart, and it belongs to you entirely." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. "But what about your wandering ways? You've lived your whole adult life on the move. What if you wake up one morning and feel trapped here?" "The only thing that's ever made me feel trapped is being away from you," he said with quiet conviction. "I've been searching my whole life for a place that feels like home. I've found it not in a patch of land or a house, but in you." Harriet's defenses crumbled at the raw honesty in his voice. "Then yes," she whispered. "I'll marry you, Yates Tucker, here at Rutherford's, anywhere as long as we're together." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, slow, brilliant, illuminating. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, for the first time, a kiss that held promise, passion, and a tenderness that made her heart swell, until she thought it might burst from her chest. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Broken Ridge, with Elijah Rutherford standing as Yates's best man, and to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Holbrook serving as Harriet's matron of honor. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, their initial gossip having given way to genuine goodwill toward the couple. As they exchanged vows, snow began to fall outside the church windows, the first of the season, large flakes drifting lazily from a pewter sky. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Yates kissed his bride with a reverence that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers in attendance. The wedding feast was held at the hotel, courtesy of the Holbrooks, and featured the last of Harriet's preserved summer vegetables alongside venison contributed by Rutherford's men. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, the community coming together to celebrate not just a marriage but the kind of love story that gave everyone hope. As evening descended and the snow fell more heavily, Yates leaned close to his new wife's ear. "We should leave soon if we want to make it home before the roads become impassable." Home. The word had never sounded sweeter to Harriet's ears. After much discussion, they had decided to make their home at her ranch, with Yates commuting to Rutherford's as needed. It was the arrangement that honored her independence while allowing them to build a future together. They slipped away amid cheers and good-natured teasing, bundling into the wagon Yates had outfitted with extra blankets for the journey. The snow was falling in earnest now, creating a white veil that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. "Are you warm enough?" Yates asked as they left town behind, his arm secure around her shoulders. "Perfectly," Harriet assured him, nestling closer. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the soft shush of snow beneath the wheels. When a particularly strong gust of wind sent a flurry of snowflakes into the wagon, Harriet shivered despite the blankets. "You'll catch cold," she said, pulling her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and tucking the edge around Yates's neck as well. He looked down at her, his face illuminated by the lantern hanging from the wagon's canopy, snowflakes catching in his eyelashes and melting on his cheeks. The love in his gaze was so palpable it took her breath away. "Not if you keep smiling like that," he murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken on that rainy day months ago, words that had marked the beginning of their journey together. Harriet's smile widened as she recognized the reference. "Is that so, Mr. Tucker?" "Absolutely, Mrs. Tucker," he confirmed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Your smile could warm a man through the coldest Montana winter." As their wagon continued through the gently falling snow, heading toward a future they would build together, Harriet marveled at how a chance encounter with a stray bull and a sudden rainstorm had changed the course of her life. Sometimes, she reflected, the most unexpected beginnings led to the most beautiful destinations. The years that followed proved the truth of that reflection. Spring came, melting the snow and bringing with it new life-tender shoots in Harriet's expanded garden, calves in the small herd of cattle they'd started with Rutherford's help, and, most precious of all, the first stirrings of a child beneath Harriet's heart. Their daughter, Emma, was born on a midsummer night with Mrs. Holbrook serving as midwife and Yates pacing the porch until the infant's lusty cries split the night air. He held his daughter with hands that trembled slightly, marveling at the perfect miniature features that somehow combined the best of both her parents. "She's magnificent," he whispered to an exhausted but radiant Harriet, "just like her mother." The ranch flourished under their joint care. Yates's knowledge of cattle complemented Harriet's skill with growing things. The apple orchard took root and began to bear fruit. They added sheep, then dairy cows, expanding gradually but prudently. By the time Emma was toddling around the farmyard, chasing chickens and chattering to the barn cats, the Tuckers were known throughout the territory for their thriving, diverse operation. Emma was 5 when her brother Daniel was born, followed 2 years later by Rebecca. Their home, once a simple ranch house, had been expanded to accommodate the growing family, a new wing added with Yates's own hands, a larger kitchen where Harriet taught her children the arts of cooking and preserving alongside reading and arithmetic. Through it all, the lean years and the abundant ones, the bitter winters and the glorious summers, Yates and Harriet's partnership remained the steady foundation upon which everything else was built. They worked side by side, laughed together, occasionally argued, usually about Yates's tendency to overprotect or Harriet's reluctance to ask for help, and always found their way back to each other at day's end. On their 25th wedding anniversary, long after the children were grown and starting families of their own, Yates and Harriet sat on the same porch swing where he had proposed, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar glory. Silver threaded their hair now, and years of outdoor work had etched lines around their eyes and mouths. But when Harriet looked at her husband, she still saw the handsome cowboy who had rescued her from a belligerent bull on a rainy afternoon. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Tucker," Yates said, his voice a little rougher with age but still warm with affection. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are," Harriet replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "All those years ago, if that bull hadn't broken through my fence, if you hadn't been tracking it." "Fate," Yates said with quiet certainty. "Or divine intervention. Either way, I'm grateful every day that I found you, even when I'm stubborn," she teased, knowing her independent streak had never fully mellowed. "Especially then," he countered with a chuckle. "Your determination is what built all this." He gestured toward their property, the thriving orchard, the well-tended fields, the sturdy barn and expanded house. "I just had the good sense to recognize a miracle when I saw one." Harriet smiled up at him, her heart as full in that moment as it had been when they exchanged their vows. "We built it together," she corrected gently. "That's what made it work, what still makes it work. We're partners in everything." "Partners," Yates agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The best decision I ever made was asking you to be mine." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the landscape in amber and gold, Harriet reflected on the life they had created, not just the prosperity of their ranch or the success of their children, but the hundreds of small moments that had woven together into a tapestry of shared experience. The early mornings and late nights, the births and deaths, the celebrations and sorrows, all of it faced together, hand in hand. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, What would have happened if you hadn't come back after that cattle drive? If you'd continued wandering? Yates was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Sometimes, he admitted, but only because it makes me more grateful that I did come back, that I found the courage to ask for what I wanted most. And what was that? She asked, though she knew the answer. His smile was as tender as it had been on their wedding day. A home, he said simply. Not a place, but a person. You, Harriet. You've been my home from the moment you told me I'd catch cold in the rain, and I knew somehow I just knew that your smile would keep me warm for the rest of my days. As night fell around them, bringing with it the familiar chorus of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, Harriet tucked herself more securely against her husband's side. The journey hadn't always been easy, but it had always been worth it. From an unexpected meeting in a rainstorm to a life built on love, respect, and partnership, it was more than she had ever dared to hope for, and everything she now knew she deserved. And as stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Harriet sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for stubborn bulls, summer storms, and cowboys who knew how to smile back when life offered them an unexpected gift.